twice in just 4 months. First in April, then again in July of 2026, the highest-ranking officials of the African Union boarded private flights and descended upon Ouagadougou, sitting face-to-face with Captain Ibrahim Traoré after 3 agonizing years of suffocating silence and punitive sanctions. Let that reality sink in for a moment. What happens when the very economic blockades and financial sanctions designed to starve a sovereign nation into quiet submission instead forge an unbreakable geopolitical fracture that completely humbles the global elite? This is no ordinary diplomatic standoff, and it is certainly not a temporary disruption. What we are witnessing in real time is the uncompromising rise of sovereign discipline, a brilliant tactical evolution where a historically marginalized African state is no longer begging for a seat at a table built by outside interests, but instead demanding that those very institutions tear themselves down, reform, and finally respect the soul of the continent. Wherever you are watching from in the diaspora, whether you are tuning in from the historic neighborhoods of Atlanta, the bustling avenues of London, or the resilient heart of the Caribbean, we are collectively watching a fight for the absolute dignity of our people. Hit that subscribe button, share this video with your community, and drop a comment below to let your voice be heard, because the struggle for true liberation requires all of us to stand up as active witnesses. To truly comprehend why the international establishment is deeply terrified of this new alliance of Sahel states, you have to look entirely past the polished diplomatic suites in Addis Ababa and focus your eyes on the hands of a woman named Kadiatou. Kadiatou is 50 years old. She lives in a small, historically neglected village in the Yatenga region of northern Burkina Faso. For decades, her daily reality has been defined by the brutal, unforgiving labor of artisanal gold mining. Look closely at her hands in your mind's eye. They are heavily calloused, deeply scarred, and permanently stained by the red African earth she has spent a lifetime clawing through just to extract raw, unrefined gold. But that gold never truly belonged to her, and it certainly never belonged to her community. The exact moment that precious metal was pulled from the dirt, it was weighed, secured, and loaded onto heavily armored transports, eventually flying out of the country to find its way into the pristine, climate-controlled vaults of Paris, Brussels, and London. Kadiatou stood every single day of her life on top of some of the most concentrated mineral wealth on the face of the earth. Yet, when the sun dipped below the horizon, her village was swallowed by total, suffocating darkness. There were no humming solar panels. There were no smooth, paved roads connecting her to the wider world. When a severe fever took hold of her children, she was forced to carry them on her back for half a day to reach a dilapidated concrete room they dared to call a clinic, only to find the shelves completely barren of even the most basic medicine. This devastating reality was not a mere accident of nature. This was meticulously engineered deprivation. This was the silent, crushing violence of a system where former national leaders, men draped in tailored European suits, spent their time in overseas capitals, smiling for international cameras and quietly signing away the sacred mineral rights of their ancestors in exchange for highly toxic loans that were weaponized against their own people. The global establishment called it foreign aid. They labeled it international cooperation. But for Kadiatou and millions of mothers like her, it was a daily, legalized theft of her humanity. While she dug for gold in the sweltering heat, her so-called leaders mortgaged her future, and the state's military apparatus slowly retreated, leaving her vulnerable community completely exposed to the terrifying creeping shadow of jihadist violence. She was forced to mine the earth in absolute terror, trapped between the militants who wanted to burn her home to the ground and a government that had already structurally abandoned her. If you are watching this from across the ocean, Kadiatu's story is not a distant, unrelatable African tragedy. Her scarred hands are the exact same hands that picked the cotton in the brutal, unrelenting heat of the American South. Her deep, bone-weary exhaustion is the exact same exhaustion of the black factory workers in the industrial Midwest who built a towering empire but were systematically redlined out of its generational prosperity. It is the exact same historical wound. It is the ongoing, systemic extraction of black labor, black resources, and black brilliance, perfectly designed to build the immense, unshakable wealth of the Western world, while leaving the originators of that wealth completely marginalized, silenced, and broken. The paradox of the gold beneath Kadiatu's weary feet is the ultimate paradox of the black experience globally, to be the undisputed foundational source of global power, yet treated by the global elite as completely disposable. But something profound and irreversible shifted in the dusty winds of Yatanga. The era of silent, obedient suffering finally met its absolute limit. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré assumed leadership in September 2022, the overwhelming response from the international establishment was not to offer assistance against encroaching terror, but to unleash a coordinated campaign of economic warfare. The African Union and the Economic Community of West African States, acting as Western proxies, activated their standard punitive playbook. They suspended Burkina Faso. They imposed crippling sanctions, slammed borders shut, and maliciously froze sovereign assets held in regional central banks. This was not a noble defense of democratic principles. This was the precise deployment of the invisible hand of neocolonial control. The objective was historically familiar: asphyxiate the independent government before it could draw a breath of genuine economic sovereignty. Understand exactly how this psychological and economic warfare operates on the physical ground. It is not fought with artillery shells. It is fought with ledgers, banking swift codes, and devastating export bans. When ECOWAS locked down the borders, they intentionally halted the massive transport trucks carrying vital grain, fuel, and medical supplies, artificially inflating the price of basic survival overnight. They sought to weaponize the hunger of the masses against their own leadership. The global elite in Paris, Washington, and Brussels understood profoundly that if Burkina Faso successfully asserted sovereign discipline over its own mineral wealth, the entire regional architecture of black exploitation would face an existential collapse. They vehemently demanded an immediate return to a system where multi-party elections merely served as a polished theater to rubber stamp the continuous flow of West African gold straight into European markets. But let us look closely at the human casualties of this economic warfare. These sterile boardroom sanctions did not starve the foreign diplomats in their air-conditioned suites. They struck directly at the heart of Kadiatu's fragile existence. When regional banks aggressively froze the state's assets, it meant the dirt roads leading to her village could not be paved, and the rural health clinic remained painfully empty of basic antibiotics. It left mothers exactly like her forced to watch their children suffer in the sweltering dark, entirely abandoned, while the international community grandstanded about the rule of law. The unadulterated hypocrisy of these continental institutions is absolutely staggering when you pull back the diplomatic curtain. For decades, the African Union watched in total silence as foreign mining conglomerates secured lucrative, one-sided extraction contracts that yielded nothing but pennies and pollution for local populations. They watched complacently as previous administrations allowed French military bases to operate deep within their sovereign territory, ostensibly to fight terrorism, yet the violence only metastasized. There were no urgent midnight summits and certainly no crippling financial sanctions when the immense wealth of the nation was being siphoned off legally by former colonial masters. But the exact moment a young African leader uncompromisingly declared that the gold of Burkina Faso would finally serve the people of Burkina Faso, the institutional machinery suddenly found its punitive teeth. This reveals the ultimate insidious trap of modern international relations. The global establishment continuously uses the sacred language of democracy as a weapon of mass economic compliance. They loudly demand rapid transition timelines and attempt to rush vulnerable nations to the ballot box in the height of a violent security crisis. Why? Because a fragmented, weak coalition government, entirely distracted by internal political bickering, is infinitely easier to manipulate and financially control than a unified state exercising unapologetic sovereign discipline. They desperately want leadership drowning in debt, leaders who will willingly trade away sovereign mineral rights just to balance a budget intentionally decimated by artificial sanctions. This is the exact brutal machinery of exploitation that Kadiatu has felt deep in her bones for half a century. The invisible hand of global finance does not leave physical fingerprints, but it leaves behind empty villages, broken infrastructure, and generations of brilliant black minds forced into inescapable poverty while standing on land bursting with extreme wealth. But the arrogant architects of this economic warfare made one historically fatal miscalculation. They assumed that isolation would simply break the spirit of the Burkinabe people, just as it had broken others in the past. They truly believed that by turning off the financial tap, the hungry population would demand a return to the very system that had exploited them. They fundamentally failed to recognize that a population enduring decades of systemic neglect has a threshold for pain that the global elite cannot comprehend. The sanctions were expertly designed to induce panic, but instead, they forged an absolute, unbreakable clarity of purpose. Isolation did not weaken the resolve of Ouagadougou. It forcibly removed the financial parasites, forcing the nation to look inward and realize that the strength to survive and conquer had always rested squarely within their own borders. The psychological breaking point for Burkina Faso did not occur in a vacuum. It was born from a profound, terrifying historical clarity. When the African Union and ECOWAS tightened their economic grip, they fully expected Captain Ibrahim Traoré to eventually bow his head, board a flight to a European capital, and sign a humiliating agreement to restore the old order. but they severely underestimated the tactical evolution happening in Ouagadougou. Traoré and the Burkinabe people looked around and recognized a brutal truth. Waiting for permission to survive from institutions fundamentally shaped by outside interests is an absolute death sentence. They realized that what the global elite politely packaged as international cooperation was, in reality, a permanent state of subjugation. To accept their terms was to agree to the slow, methodical erasure of their own sovereign discipline. One only has to look at the tragic historical graveyard of neighboring African nations to understand exactly why this pivot was a matter of sheer survival. For decades, the African continent has been entirely suffocated by the false promises of foreign bailouts and structural adjustment programs. We have all seen the devastating cycle play out right next door. A vulnerable nation facing manufactured economic instability is pressured to accept a massive financial rescue package from the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. But this money is never a gift. It is a meticulously crafted chain. In exchange for the cash, the nation is forced to privatize its state-owned utilities, gut its public education, and hand over exclusive extraction rights for its mineral wealth to foreign mega corporations. The result? The local currency collapses, the political elite siphon off the capital, and the streets explode into endless, manufactured chaos. They traded the permanent soul of the continent for a temporary illusion of stability, sinking into a generational debt trap from which they could never emerge. Kadiatu does not need to read the complex, sterilized macroeconomic reports published in Washington or Paris to understand this exact betrayal. She knows the bitter, metallic taste of this trap intimately. She is a global sharecropper, working land she is never allowed to own, constantly indebted to a system she did not create. She remembers vividly when previous administrations proudly announced that they had secured new foreign loans, promising that the immense wealth would finally trickle down to the rural provinces of the Sahel. But the promised concrete infrastructure never arrived. The dirt roads leading to her village only deepened into impassable mud. The local wells were deliberately diverted to serve heavily guarded, foreign-owned industrial mining sites, and the cost of basic sorghum violently doubled. Every single time the global elite threw out a financial lifeline, it wrapped aggressively around the necks of the working poor like Kadiatu, choking the very life out of their vulnerable communities while the gold continued to flow north. This agonizing cycle of betrayal triggered the most significant geopolitical fracture of the 21st century. The government in Ouagadougou made a conscious, monumental decision to fundamentally redefine the battlefield. When the Western-backed institutions and their regional proxies proudly declared to the international press that Burkina Faso was now isolated, Traoré did not panic and he did not retreat. He firmly embraced it. The leadership executed a brilliant shift in perspective. They understood that what the establishment weaponized as isolation was, in truth, a long overdue geopolitical quarantine. Burkina Faso was not being cut off from the civilized world. They were actively, intentionally cleansing themselves from a deeply parasitic financial and political system. You absolutely cannot claim true liberation while your domestic economy is tethered to a colonial currency printed in a European capital. And while your strategic security is outsourced to the very nations that benefit from your instability, the pivot required absolute, uncompromising action. It meant looking directly at the sprawling, heavily fortified foreign military bases, structures that were never genuinely built to protect the Burkinabe people, but rather to permanently secure the extraction routes for West African gold and uranium, and recognizing them not as allies, but as towering monuments of foreign occupation. The realization swept through the dusty streets and the rural villages alike. True security and uncompromised dignity would never arrive on a cargo plane from Paris or Brussels. For Kadiatu, standing under the scorching sun in Yatenga, this profound shift in national consciousness was not abstract political theory. It was a physical, palpable change in the very air she breathed. For the absolute first time in her 50 years of life, the rhetoric echoing from the capital did not sound like the polished, subservient apologies of the broken leaders of the past. It resonated with the fierce, uncompromising truth of the red soil she had mined her entire life. The agonizing economic pinch of the current sanctions was no longer viewed as a punishment. The people began to understand it as the agonizing, necessary birth pangs of a proud nation, finally severing the toxic umbilical cord of colonial dependence. They stopped asking for a seat at the master's table, and they began the arduous, revolutionary work of building their own. The manifestation of this awakening was not confined to passionate speeches. It was immediately translated into tangible physical action. In 2023, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger forged the alliance of Sahel states as an active, unyielding military confederation. By January 2024, they formally withdrew from ECOWAS, shredding the treaties that bound them to exploitative regional proxies. But the true strike that sent shockwaves through Western capitals was economic. The government moved decisively to weaponize its own earth. In July 2026, Burkina Faso inaugurated its first fully state-owned gold mine, operated by the national mining company Sopamib, located in the Yatenga region. They fundamentally rewrote the mining code, systematically stripping foreign extraction companies of their predatory monopolies over the lifeblood of the nation. Visualize the profound disruption of this moment. For decades, the roads in Yatenga only saw armored convoys securing the wealth of the nation for the benefit of distant European stakeholders. Today, those same heavy transport trucks are rolling down the red dirt roads, carrying state-owned gold directly to the national treasury. This is what sovereign discipline looks like in real time. The profits from those heavily guarded transports are no longer disappearing into the offshore accounts of foreign conglomerates. They are actively being converted into poured concrete, vast arrays of humming solar grids, and newly stocked medical dispensaries across the rural provinces. They are systematically transforming the blood-stained soil into the foundational pillars of true national independence. And as the heavy machinery broke ground on the new state-owned mines, Kadiatu watched the dust rise, but for the very first time, it did not sting her eyes with the familiar bite of despair. When the local government began laying the foundation for a permanent medical outpost just a few miles from her home, she recognized the material proof of a promise kept. The very gold she had spent her life scraping from the earth was finally being molded into a shield to protect her children. This tangible reclamation of dignity provides the ultimate counter-narrative to the relentless psychological warfare deployed by the West. Every brick laid in Yatenga is a direct, undeniable defiance of the crippling economic sanctions designed to break their backs. This sovereign discipline extended seamlessly from the gold mines to the highest levels of international diplomacy. Ouagadougou ceased playing the victim and began dictating the terms of engagement. In a stunning display of tactical evolution, just 24 hours before sitting down with African Union officials in July 2026, Burkina Faso's government decisively expelled 2 senior European Union diplomats, declaring them persona non grata. It was a cold, calculated signal. The days of European paternalism are permanently eradicated, yet simultaneously they opened focused, strategic security dialogues with the British and the Russians, not as subservient proxies seeking a new master, but as equal architects of their own regional stability. They effectively diversified their alliances, ensuring that no single foreign power would ever again hold the monopolistic leverage that France had ruthlessly exercised for over half a century. The ripple effect of this uncompromising posture triggered absolute, unmitigated panic among the global elite. The very institutions that had arrogantly attempted to isolate Burkina Faso suddenly found themselves staring into the terrifying abyss of their own irrelevance. This brings us directly back to the startling reality of those desperate flights in 2026, when the chairman of the African Union arrived in April and the Commission chairperson followed in July. They did not step onto the tarmac as powerful overlords coming to collect an apology. They arrived as deeply compromised representatives of a crumbling old order, desperately attempting to maintain a foothold in a region that had boldly outgrown them. The invisible hand had been broken by the sheer force of collective, disciplined will. The meetings inside the presidential palace in Ouagadougou completely inverted the established hierarchy of continental power. Burkina Faso's leadership did not sit across the table offering frantic transition timelines or begging for debt relief. Instead, the Burkinabe foreign minister looked directly at the highest authorities of the African Union and aggressively demanded that the AU itself undergo objective and bold reform. He pointedly instructed the continental body to secure its own financial independence, noting that it was the AU's utter lack of authentic solidarity that had forced the Sahel states to guarantee their own sovereignty in the first place. The institution that had spent 3 years demanding that Burkina Faso explain its unconstitutional changes was suddenly, brilliantly forced to explain its own complicity in the neo-colonial exploitation of Africa. This is not merely a diplomatic victory. It is the total collapse of an insidious psychological operation. For generations, the Western establishment has relied on a specific formula to maintain control over the global South. Apply enough economic pressure, manufacture enough internal chaos, and eventually the marginalized population will beg for foreign intervention. But when you apply that pressure to a people who have already endured the absolute bottom of systemic deprivation, you do not manufacture surrender. You forge an impenetrable, hardened solidarity. The global elite are not terrified because Burkina Faso possesses a massive military arsenal. They are terrified because Burkina Faso is demonstrating to the rest of the oppressed world that the sanctions trap is an illusion. They are proving that a nation can survive and thrive entirely outside the predetermined boundaries of the Western financial system. As the sun sets over the Yatenga region today, the darkness does not swallow Kadiatu's village the way it did for the first 50 years of her life. Tonight, she stands beneath the steady, bright glow of a newly installed solar street lamp, powered by the intentional reinvestment of her nation's own mineral wealth. That single beam of light piercing the Sahelian night is more powerful than any geopolitical treatise ever drafted in a European capital. It represents the quiet, unbreakable dignity of a mother who knows that her labor is no longer being stolen to finance the luxury of her oppressors. The storm of economic warfare came to wash them away, but the establishment failed to realize that the people of Burkina Faso are not the leaves blown about in the wind. They are the deep ancestral roots holding the earth together. The era of passive waiting and quiet suffering on the African continent has officially come to a definitive end. What we are witnessing today in Burkina Faso under Captain Ibrahim Traoré is not a temporary political rebellion. It is a permanent, generational reclamation of the black soul. For far too long, the global establishment has arrogantly dictated the terms of our survival, fully expecting us to trade our sacred dignity for the meager crumbs of their economic exploitation. But sovereign discipline dictates a much harder truth. True liberation is never generously gifted from a polished colonial desk in Europe. It must be seized, anchored deep in the ancestral soil, and defended with an uncompromising, ironclad resolve. The Western powers and their regional proxies aggressively unleashed a storm of economic warfare meant to completely wash this movement away. They fully expected the nation to fracture under the weight of artificial poverty and ultimately beg for a return to the old familiar chains. But history has a profound, undeniable way of remembering not those who cowardly avoided the storm, but those who boldly stood their ground directly inside it. Today, Kadiatu no longer breaks her back mining the earth to build European empires. She mines her sovereign soil to physically build the future of her own lineage. Her heavily calloused hands have become the undisputed architects of her nation's true independence. To every single person watching this across the global diaspora, from the historic civil rights battlegrounds of the United States to the resilient, vibrant islands of the Caribbean, this is absolutely your fight too. Our historical struggles are intimately tethered across the oceans. The invisible hands that systematically attempt to redline our neighborhoods, aggressively undervalue our physical labor, and silence our political voices are the exact same forces that desperately try to starve the Sahel into quiet submission. But the global elite made one fatal, irreversible miscalculation. As the powerful proverb echoes deeply through our shared history, they tried to bury us, but they did not know we were seeds. We are actively witnessing the unstoppable blooming of a fiercely independent Africa, an Africa that unapologetically writes its own rules and answers only to its own people. I need you to stand as an active witness to this movement. Hit that subscribe button right now so we can continue to uncover the truth. Share this video far and wide with your family and community, and drop a comment below to let the establishment know exactly where you stand. The geopolitical plates of the world have permanently shifted, and we are no longer the silent spectators of our own history. We are the ultimate authors of our true liberation. Until next time, stay grounded, stay resolute, and never, ever compromise your sovereign dignity.